Sorry folks, just a bit of an interruption there, so I had to pause the video. There was someone coming in the door. I'm over visiting with some people at the moment in Washington DC, believe it or not, just for the weekend. So I'll be back tomorrow, but there's some coming and going here, so I apologize for that. But we were just talking about how people are sort of and maybe even myself, you know, having set up the argument from the last two sessions that were kind of suspicious about science and politics interacting, that maybe it's understandable that people might sort of take from that a sort of a generalized fear of science in the round. And as Naomi Klein, she's a journalist and a commentator, recently wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine, and she has a book about global warming coming out pretty soon. And as she's sort of inclined to argue, you know, science isn't really about necessarily accepting. The true scientific spirit, believe it or not, is about skepticism, right? And it's about keeping a skeptical distance from any sort of dogmatic acceptance of the truth. So, in a way, a truly scientific attitude would be very much on board with the kind of skepticism that we've been trying to create in the class over the last couple of weeks, especially vis-a-vis these sort of human relationships that we've been talking about. But maybe when it comes to the physical world, it's important to keep that skepticism, but also to accept that what science is really putting forward is an idea that so long as the data is clear, so long as there's generalizations that we can accept from the data that are founded in a process where we say this isn't necessarily the truth, but it's data that we can accept, you know, then we have perhaps the makings, and I'm sure that it would be philosophically more complicated than this, but we have the makings of an argument that suggests that we would be forgiven in taking action in the absence of contradicting data, right? So it's very easy to come up with contradicting data, for example, about the phrenologists that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, because we today, and even at the time, had very, very clear ways of measuring the intelligence of different races of human beings and understanding that despite what the phrenologists were saying, there was no real evidence in the intelligence difference between all these different types of people. But we do have evidence, and so therefore, you know, when we look at what the community of scientists on the planet are saying, something like 99% of them who are publishing in scientific journals are reporting in that there's incontrovertible evidence at this stage of global warming, that the data is very much there, and our choice as students is to think about whether we want to accept that data or not. Not to say that global warming is true or that it's truly man-made, but to suggest that the data is pushing us in the direction of that conclusion. And we can still maintain a healthy dose of skepticism, of course, but that's appropriate to science. Well, what worries us is where we would say that the 99% of scientists that are reporting in now are wrong somehow, or that they somehow have an agenda, or that somehow, as Glenn Beck might say, they're liberals and they're just out to basically sneak in their agenda via this sort of spurious scientific arguments. If that was the case, then we would have no confidence in science whatsoever. And so the question would be then, you know, are we not guilty of the same mistake that people were guilty of when they doubted Christopher Columbus, coming back with evidence that the world was in fact round and not flat? Are we not effectively those who would deny the power of science to say anything useful at all? And I don't think that's what we've been arguing in this class, and I don't think that's what would be a helpful basis for us to think about global warming today. And that's not to say that it's clear what we should do about global warming, but it is very important to sort of think about this point about science, you know. I think it's safe to say at this stage that the vast, as we said, 99% of scientists writing in the scientific journals believe that global warming is happening. And so we would be in a difficult situation ourselves now, coming up with a sort of a cynical response to that. Better to maintain a healthy skepticism, indeed, but to understand that science, while it's about skepticism, does at a certain point argue that we need to accept the data when the data is in. So response 3 then would be, instead of just sort of a passive, well, there's nothing we can do about it, that was response 1, the disaster theory, zombie revolution kind of thing. Response 2 is to doubt the science. Response 3 is to say, okay, on the basis of what we know, we should be going forward to try to do something about this. And so we call this response green theory. And where it's clear that green theory is an increasingly popular philosophy, many of us don't know what green theory is, or environmentalism. So I'm citing a scholar here, Cynthia Weber, who argues that all environmentalism agrees that our received wisdom about the relationship between nature, the natural environment, and culture, the human environment, must be questioned. This is this idea then that, as we were saying before, many people, historically speaking, have suggested that the environment is something that's just out there for us to use, to sort of be there at our command, at our beck and call. We're challenging that idea here. We're suggesting that, in fact, that attitude, while it might have been fine once upon a time, historically speaking, should be challenged today, because clearly there are limits to the amount that we can grow as a species on in terms of our relationship to the planet. One of the seminal arguments that's come out in relation to green theory once upon a time was Al Gore's argument, Inconvenient Truth. I think it's about 10 years old at this stage. But Inconvenient Truth was Al Gore's movie, and it's well worth watching, actually, even if you don't particularly like Al Gore, and a lot of people, I appreciate, think he's a bit of a charlatan. But the science behind his movie is broadly accepted. He skirts over a couple of things, I think, for the purpose of the movie, to simplify the tale, and certainly some people would want to challenge some of the ways he's representing some truths, but broadly speaking, it's thought that Al Gore is making a fairly good faith effort here with this movie. Al Gore, as a green theorist or as an environmentalist, would be suggesting that not taking an instrumentalist stance vis-a-vis nature, that saying that the environment is not just something out there that should be challenged, or consumed rather, but saying that in fact the more we consume, the more we're undermining our own ability to live in a sustainable a relationship with the environment. He would argue that to not take a challenge of that instrumentalism, to not become an environmentalist, to not be a green theorist, is literally to agree with a philosophy or an approach that would end up literally killing human beings. And I think that's the hugely important point. So we have a lot of people to lump into this kind of instrumentalist philosophy or instrumentalist category of analysis. We could talk about the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, Plato. They all sort of believed in just expanding into the environment. The Bible clearly suggests or shows that Christianity advocates a sort of a limitless expanding into the environment. God appears to various people in the Bible and suggests that there you go, this is the land I've laid out for you. It's yours to do with as you wish. Now, obviously, I think some people have found in the Bible areas where the Bible does sort of assert a more stewardship type relationship with the earth, and I'm sure that that's in there too. But Christian dogma has generally gone the other way, I believe. And then even Marxism, so, putting a challenge to this idea that it's just the left that cares about the environment. Even Marx's writings seem to suggest that the environment is just there as a passive instrument that we can use and abuse as we wish. So Al Gore and other environmental theorists are challenging that and suggesting that, in fact, no, we do need to challenge our relationship to the planet, lest we hurt ourselves. So we're talking still about global warming, about green theory. These are some of the early texts now that were central to the emergence of a sensitivity to the environment. We see Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. We see Bill McKibben's much earlier book from 1989 called The End of Nature. And these were early books that were really fighting an uphill battle. They were early books in generating this consciousness that the environment is not something that's just out there. In other words, if I'm going back to use my word instrumentalism, they were books that really challenge instrumentalism, that the environment is just an instrument of our will. And what were these books identifying? They weren't so much talking about global warming, but they were talking about things like DDT, which was a fertilizer, and a pesticide, that was causing harm to human beings. Rachel Carson asserted in Silent Spring that the pesticide DDT had physiological and environmental effects. And of course, her book met with ferocious denial from chemical companies, but it did spur a reversal in national pesticide policy, leading to a nationwide ban on DDT and other pesticides. It was called Silent Spring. Her book was called Silent Spring because of an observed decline in bird populations correlated with increased use of pesticides. So DDT, i.e. the bird song, was gone. So DDT was banned in many areas then as a result of this, although it was never banned for anti-malaria spraying, which is where people still to this day think it's actually quite useful. So because obviously malaria has such a negative impact on human well-being that there are certain times when you may want to use it. Now we can also talk about CFCs as another great result, our achievement of this sort of early environmental or green awareness. Carbon tetrachloride, or the CFCs, was originally used in fire extinguishers. Then it came to be reused in refrigerators and aerosols. But the problem is that the particulates that it was used is a propellant for, I guess, for aerosols and such. As a propellant, it could last 100 years up in the atmosphere, and they would interact with the ultraviolet radiation from the sun to bleach the ozone out of the upper atmosphere, creating an ozone hole whereby the harmful rays of the sun could penetrate through and ultimately damage our skin. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol was introduced by governments as an international declaration and law that stated that CFCs had to be banned. And that was a very successful operation, and it was accomplished with some pain, admittedly, but it was a great success. And then also internationally, we've had the banning of leaded gasoline as a victory in green consciousness. In the 1920s, it was discovered that lead additives in gasoline could help preserve engines. But the scientist Claire Patterson discovered the pollution layer of lead by looking at ice core samples from Greenland, which showed that it became present in the environment only with the commencement of gasoline emissions. So this was an idea that lead and gasoline burning were related to each other, and so we got the lead out. We got the lead out through legislation, and pretty much all over the Western world now you will not find lead in gasoline. And that's another tremendous victory of environmental legislation. So, you know, environmentalism has won some victories, and it's not that we have always, you know, in the past had this cynicism towards science. But as we were saying in one of the previous slides, many people are cynical about science today. Now, interestingly, that never used to be the case. If you go back 10, 15 years ago, there was no correlation between whether you were a Republican and a Democrat and the fact that you might believe in global warming. But as Naomi Klein argued, and I forgot to mention this in the previous slide, that if you look at today's numbers, there's a huge correlation between people who believe in global warming and who would be liberals or vote Democratic, and people who do not believe in global warming and who are conservatives or vote Republican. And that's a really interesting question that speaks to the politicization of science, and it's not clear that that is at all helpful for us in terms of the debate we're trying to have here. I mean, is it necessarily the case that the science is a liberal conspiracy? That's what I'm trying to get towards this point. If 99% of scientists are reporting in that global warming is happening, probably a good number of them are conservative themselves. So it's not clear at all that to be a global warming scientist you need to be a liberal. It would seem that perhaps that's very unhelpful. Yet that is the reality of the world we're living in, where this has been politicized. So I'll skip through this slide very quickly because I appreciate this is turning into a long lecture. Carson and McKibben are just two examples of important books that sought to draw attention to the fact that human beings do have the power to significantly alter the environment around them. Environmental scientists have had many victories, what most important thing that I'm trying to raise here, and if you remember the assigned supplemental reading from this week's texts, one of the things we're talking about is a cultural dynamic of environmental change, that the environmental companies, Greenpeace, World Wildlife Foundation, Friends of the Earth, on the basis of the popular consciousness coming out of books like Silent Spring, have become very aware that the way you change global legislation on the environment is through first of all, appealing to people's hearts and minds and getting them to put pressure on the politicians. And that's been the way that global environmental change has taken place over the last decades, with new high-profile non-governmental organizations, or NGOs as we call them, emerging in response to this new demand for a global justice in the environment, or a global coordination, or a global governance of the environment. So that's very, very important if you're reading the supplemental texts for this week. Now, there's some question here, and it's just worth touching on. I'll touch on it very, very quickly, as to whether or not global warming can be fought through capitalism. And why would we say that? Well, because many people suggest that untrammeled free markets have no ability to compel the producers in the marketplace to put the price of their emissions into the price of the good that they're charging. And this is of course the basis of what we call the free rider argument, that some people get on the bus and they don't pay their fare. In a way, we are all on the bus of the environment, but are we paying our fare? The sandwich that's made in Pittsburgh and driven down to Chillicothe is a sandwich that has been brought to us to a certain extent on the basis of a free ride. The sandwich did not pay its full fare. It did not pay the cost of the rising sea levels and the impact on our security and on the human beings in the various parts of the world that will have to relocate, or who are going to have their lifestyles affected by storms, by rising sea levels, by increased disease, by increased environmental insecurity of the sort that we were talking about earlier on. This is a really important question, because Al Gore, in his movie, even though on the surface of things he comes over as being a green theorist, in his movie he is suggesting that really what we have to do is to, and you see these very fine words here that he's offered us as a quote, which are inspiring, and he's suggesting that it's a real challenge. It's the challenge of the moment. But the solution that he's actually putting forward, a practical solution he's actually putting forward, is that we've got to do it through the marketplace. What Al Gore wants to do is he wants to reach out to you and me and get us to shop differently in the grocery store. He wants us to get us to go to the grocery store and buy organic, locally produced goods and services, and show the marketplace, show the producers that what we're actually looking for, what we're actually interested in as consumers, is environmentally sensitive material. And okay, Al Gore, fine, but many people would suggest that that's just not practical, that we'll be waiting a long time for the market to respond in that way. Because why? Because those goods and services that he's asking us all to buy are more expensive by and large for most people, and they're not always available. So if you're poor and you cannot afford to go to Whole Foods to buy these exquisite, gourmet, organic, locally produced potatoes and tomatoes, then you're going to go to the store and buy the local stuff. And you're going to end up buying tomatoes that were produced God knows where, because we live in globalization, of course. And so one wonders then, is it not perhaps a little bit naive to put all these expectations on the consumer, that in fact maybe the market is not the way to solve this, that there does need to be a check on the market, or a constraint on the market, and a regulation put on the market that compels it to extract further costs for goods and services, so that the price of those goods and services, if they're being shipped from very far away, is reflected, thereby creating an incentive for a return to locally produced goods and services on the margin. So that would be one reason that we would challenge Al Gore's status as a green theorist, that he was sort of coming at it more from an idealized communication perspective with the masses, and that he may not, in fact, be all that much of a green theorist at all, because he's not willing to put the environment at the center of his politics. He still believes that human beings can have their cake and eat it too, if that makes any sense. I hope it does. So in the next slide then, we just have a brief bit of information about Al Gore's argument as sort of a footnote here. just to elaborate the point, he says there are good people in both parties, i.e. Republicans and Democrats, who hold the truth of global warming at arm's length. And that's true, because if they acknowledge it, then the big moral imperative is to make change. We have to make a lot of change, and that's fair enough. And of course, here in the slide, he's standing in front of the image of Hurricane Katrina, showing that he's making a clear linkage, or drawing a clear linkage between Hurricane Katrina and global warming, which I think is incontrovertible. Not that, and I think Al Gore would be the first person to say this, global warming does not cause hurricanes, right? It didn't cause the hurricane that hit New York last year, but global warming does make hurricanes more intense. It does make them more unpredictable, and certainly the fact that a hurricane hit New York City square on is a kind of a historically very, very rare, unprecedented phenomena, and it's worth paying attention to. You know, why are the North Atlantic hurricanes becoming more numerous and more intense and more unpredictable, doing more damage to us than before? So he says if we're going to do the right thing, then we're going to create a lot of wealth. See, he's saying we can have our cake and eat it too, because we're going to create a lot of jobs doing the right thing, and this is going to move us forward. And that to ignore this calling would be deeply unethical. Now, I probably do share Al Gore's view that to do the right thing would create a lot of jobs, but I'm just not so certain that doing it all through the marketplace, doing it all through changing the way we consume, is the way forward. I think we need probably a more centralized and managed process, but that's controversial in America, I think, sometimes because people associate that with socialism, and it's not clear that Americans are very comfortable with this idea of doing anything in a way that looks socialist. But we've done a lot of things socialistically before. We've centralized our resources, for example, to put a man on the moon. And no one really complained about that then, but it took a strong government operation to do that, and there's many other things that have taken strong government operations to do, and people in the past have understood them as being basically common investments of our common goods and resources in doing something together, because of the scale that it allows us to achieve in a way that the market just simply isn't interested in. Think about the achievement of full penetration of copper wire telephone network in America. That would not have been possible without the government. Think about the road network, the Eisenhower interstate highway project. It would not have been possible without the government. And so, you know, private enterprise doesn't do everything. Sometimes we do need the government to step in there and do things with us and for us. So that perhaps does challenge Al Gore's argument that he is as green as sometimes he's made out to be by the people who hate him. Probably he's a much more market-based guy than a green-based guy, in terms of at least of his solutions. I'll skip through this slide because it's not that relevant for us for our lecture today. This is the one I want to end on. This is Slavoj Zizek, and I'm going to put a link to this video on the YouTube, on our Blackboard page, and I'd like you guys to watch this clip. It's very, very insightful, because here Zizek is raising a really important point. He's suggesting that we need to change our attitude towards trash, because one of our main problems is a sort of a psychic forgetting that we engage in when we think we can just flush our rubbish away. You know, all the plastic, all the poop and shit, as he says, using his idiosyncratic language. He's you know, of a mind that we simply think that this stuff just disappears. Now, for some, says Zizek, this is a vile act because it defiles the sanctity of nature, right? When we flush away, we throw all our stuff into nature and expect nature just to absorb it, and this is vile, he says. And he very much wants us to be aware of what we're flushing, and the fact that it is dirt, and it does harm us in the long run to be living in a world where our environmental sort of ghosts are coming back to haunt us, so to speak. But what he's very much opposed to, and you'll see this in the video, is this very sort of black and white distinction that people tend to draw, and often they are environmentalists. And I guess he's sort of challenging Al Gore and other people in this sense, that perhaps the environment is not as special or as sanctified or religiously, spiritually somehow special as it's often made out to be. To do this, he makes an argument that perhaps our thinking about the environment is typically based on this idea that it's, if it wasn't for human beings, the environment would be really special, kind of like Avatar. Have you seen the movie Avatar, where, the whole planet is living in harmony with itself, and it's very peaceful and lovely, and, everyone gets along together, and, they're all vegetarians, and no one eats animals or anything like that. Well, Zizek says this is just complete idealization. It's a nonsense, because nature is constant catastrophe, and if you look at everything around us, the mere existence of oil, for example, we don't stop to think about it, but oil itself came from a huge catastrophe which destroyed practically all life on the planet, all in one fell swoop. That's his understanding of the origin of the vast majority of the oil reserves on the planet, that there had to be a huge carnage and everything had to die all at once practically, and then be submerged under layers and layers of dirt in order to create the biomass that ultimately, millennia later became oil for us. So this is an interesting argument, right? Because he's suggesting that we can't afford to idealize the environment. So for Zizek, to be an environmentalist then is a really interesting thing. It's not to idealize, it's not to worship nature like some kind of lofty spiritual domain of perfection, as in the movie Avatar, spoilt only by man. He points to the very existence of oil, as we've suggested, as the basis of this argument. So if we're going to be environmentalists, then we need to respect this destructive thing about nature, and we need to understand that we're part of it, and it's not just about like living in harmony in nature, restoring the balance. Like, we are going to mess stuff up, we are going to be dirty, we are going to destroy things. It's part of who we are, and it's not so much to achieve perfection or to turn back the clock, but to learn how to live in balance with that, I think, is what he's saying. So that's the end of the lecture then. I just want to wrap up by looking at a couple of journal questions that you guys have to deal with this week. Here they are. These are the questions that are likely to end up on the multiple choice exam, and you can see that they're just basically questions that have come up either in the lecture or in the readings, but I've tried to hit on them all in the lecture. So Simon Dalby suggests that the word environment is often used to lump together any non-human aspect of our existence. What did the term originally mean? So what Dalby is suggesting here, and I think this is foreshadowing Zizek's video, interestingly enough, that we have this tendency to lump together all this non-human, non-us as somehow nature, and create this very sanctified vision of nature that's separate to human existence. But he's like, that's not really what the environment originally meant. Environment originally meant just like our surroundings, the space that surrounds us. And so it wasn't somehow a dignified, naturalistic term. It didn't normally imply nature, it just meant surrounding space. Today we have this sort of fantastically idealized understanding of nature that's out there. And Zizek, and I think Dalby, would argue that that's actually harmful. If you want to be an environmentalist, that's kind of the wrong way to go around it, because you end up creating a set of goals and an idealization that through your behavior you can't ever possibly hope to satisfy, because you have the human problem constantly, and you've separated human beings from nature, and that's not really what it should be about. Whereas the key theme that was introduced into environmental discourse in 1987 by the Brundtland Report, this was a huge turnaround in environmental understanding, was the idea of man and nature living in some sort of balance. Of course, the idea here is sustainability, and so you might want to write a little bit about that in your journals and your thoughts about sustainability. That's from the Simon Dalby chapter. What is the maximum amount of CO2 argued by Bill McKibben to be safe for life to continue comfortably on the planet? We had that in the lecture. It's the basis, in fact, of the name of his organization that he set up in order to safeguard or to assert the argument that we need to do a better job safeguarding the planet's temperatures. What groups or individuals have offered an instrumentalist reading of nature? We were just talking about that not that long ago in this lecture. There's a wide variety of them. Some are Christian, some are Marxist. You might want to talk a little bit about that. Why might not Al Gore be considered a green theorist? That could come up in the exam. What antidote does Zizek, who we were just talking about, suggest as a remedy for our tendency to exalt nature? And then finally, what term is used by Wapner to express the content of Greenpeace's political mode of action? And again, it's about understanding that Greenpeace and other organizations now believe that it's not a good idea to directly lobby government to create environmental change because government doesn't listen. Basically, they would argue it's in the back pocket of large businesses, and that trying to create change that way would not be any good. So Greenpeace appeals to the masses, and it appeals to our political culture in order to try to get us to be more literate environmental citizens and respond that way. And that's probably a very effective way to proceed, actually. But that's in the Wapner piece from the supplemental reading for this week. So there you go, folks. That's the end of this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking with you about it. Take care. Bye-bye.